Now, before we start, I have to give you a warning that this podcast contains middle-class women of a certain age. Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction from Sky News with me, Beth Rigby.
Me, Ruth Davidson.
And me, Harriet Harman.
Thanks so much for getting in touch after last week's double episode. We had some very moving messages about assisted dying. We really appreciate you sending them in. And as a complete aside, we also had this from Andrea.
Hi ladies, love the pod. Been listening to Alistair and Rory for my bedtime listening for a few years now, and now I get to go to bed with you guys too. Pod really made me laugh when I heard you refer to Steer Karma, as my mum endlessly and inadvertently calls him Stir Karma. Kind of has a ring to it.
I went to see Keir Starmer earlier today, and we're going to be talking about that because coming up, let's talk about the Keir Starmer speech today, because the government has put forward a plan for change, a 42-page document. It is not, I repeat, apparently not a reset, but it is a set of milestones that Keir Starmer is now saying he wants his government to be measured on. How did it go? I mean, we'll get into that. And then we also get to say, as middle-class women of a certain age, we're also going to get our say on the Gregg Wallace story, because I can tell you that the two middle-class women of a certain age that I am looking at down the lens have quite strong views on this. Okay, so it is Thursday evening. I've spent my day covering the Prime Minister, setting out his 6 targets that he wants to hit before the election. In essence, what they are is a checklist for you to measure his government on. He said today they're there so that you, the public, can hold his feet to the fire to make sure he's delivering. And the milestones are basically about living standards. So he's saying household disposable income by the end of this parliament, he wants it to rise. Now, they did have a previous commitment on the economy, which was to become the fastest growing economy in the G7. This, government insiders tell me, is an attempt to make that a more human pledge. But look, that's the pledge on the living standards, 1.5 million new homes. On education, getting 75% of 5-year-olds school ready, clean energy by 2030, that a long-held mission pledge, tackling crime, 13,000 more police officers and a bobby on the beat in every neighbourhood, and then the NHS, getting back to the NHS standard of 92% of people being seen for elective treatment within 18 weeks. It is a target that hasn't been hit for a decade. Now, you might feel that there is a glaring omission in all of these targets, which we will get onto. There was nothing in the actual milestones on migration. But look, Ruth, I've just run through the targets. The Prime Minister said they were the most ambitious targets for a government in a generation. How ambitious do you think they are? And how big a risk is it if he doesn't hit them?
I thought it was quite an odd speech. I found it a bit disjointed and a bit clunky, almost as if it was written by more than one person, because at some points he was quite coaxing, very soothing voiced, and then some bits were quite punchy. I thought actually probably his best line was when he was talking about where this was pitched. So he said that it's not overblown, over-promising like Boris. It's not accepting managed decline like Rishi. I thought that was a good line. But then, you know, some of the stuff that was in there were things that he'd previously flagged up as not good enough. So, for example, one of the things he'd claimed about when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister and going into the election and talking about what he should be judged against were things like halving inflation. And he said, well, look, inflation isn't really in the gift of the government. It was something that was going to come down anyway. So, you know, that was too easy. And then one of the things that he was asking to be measured against was people's standard of living going up. Now, it has gone up under every single parliament. And actually, he's slightly getting caught out there. But I thought for me, the biggest failing really was that, again, this thing that I keep coming back to of telling a national story, telling the story about what he's trying to achieve wasn't there. Tell us the story behind the numbers. Tell us the story of your government. Tell us the story of the country. Tell us the story of what you're trying to achieve.
Harriet, I wanted to ask you about this because I cover every twist and turn of the government. That's my job. I cover it all, so you out there don't have to do that. And I have followed Keir Starmer for a long time, and it started off with 5 missions. There were then 6 first steps. He added in small boats into that first steps for government in the run-up to the election. And then today we have another document, Take Education. He promised to have 6,500 teachers additional. That was a pretty clear pledge. And then now the milestone is about early years education, getting kids ready. I'm not criticising either pledge. I'm just trying to make the point that I find it quite confusing. Is it me, Harriet? Is that unfair?
Well, I think it is actually, because I think that the government can be having 6 milestones, which are non-negotiable things, which it's absolutely determined to achieve. But those are not going to be the only 6 things they do. And to be fair, I think the things do all head in the right direction. But I'm not so sure that the speech was entirely directed at the public, for the public to be able to remember them all. I think what was most significant to me about the speech is that it was like a mandate to ministers, to civil servants, to local councils, to businesses, is that this is what the government has been elected to do, and you better get behind it. And it was really just a sort of declaration of determination that this has got to be done, including in relation to the Bat Tunnel. Well, I had to look up the Bat Tunnel and HS2, but then I thought the bats looked very sweet.
He's going to kill the bats.
And I suddenly wondered whether I was going to be a blocker and a naysayer.
I'm going to jump in and quickly explain the Bat Tunnel, because honestly, in this speech, he starts talking about the way in which planning gets frustrated and taxpayers' money gets spent on what he was, I think, implying were ridiculous things. And this was about the Bat Tunnel for HS2.
It was basically so the bats go over the tunnel and not go into the train and be killed. But I think what he was trying to do is talk about the blizzard of obstruction that is always in the way.
I think he was trying to kill the bats.
I think the bats have had it, and therefore he's going to cut through the blizzard of objections. So I think that's what it was, as much to civil servants and ministers as it was to the public and to local councils, because everywhere there's NIMBY groups springing up, everywhere there's councils saying we can't be doing the house building, and also an encouragement to business. We are going to do these things, so you can go alongside, and this is what you can be part of.
And the thing that struck me was how much of this sounded really like us when we were getting frustrated when the Tories were in government, talking about the civil service being a blob, and almost like shots being fired at Whitehall. And you know, and to the point where I went and I came home and I looked it up, and there was a bit where he obviously knew himself that it sounded a lot like that, because he said, I don't think there's a swamp to be drained here. And that's a reference to Trump talking about draining the swamp of Washington. But he's talking about, you know, we've totally lost sight of in British politics right across Whitehall that our job is to do hard things. You know, it's been internalised. Westminster is don't say anything, don't do anything ambitious, set targets are going to happen anyway. And he's really like cracking on into the civil service, who, when we were complaining about it being a blob, were getting shouted down as saying, well, look, you need to have these people inside. This is really bad. You know, work with your civil servants, not against them. And it was quite hardcore, actually. And, you know, I'm just thinking, like, you've been in the door 5 minutes. What on earth has happened behind closed doors that we don't know about, that you're already this frustrated?
At one point, he said, make no mistake, this plan will land on desks across Whitehall with the heavy thud of a gauntlet being thrown down. And then he went on and he said, I do think there are too many people in Whitehall who are comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline. So I do think it was a speech also, as you both know, aimed at Whitehall. But is that a smart way to go if you need these people to help you do it?
Well, I think there's 2 things on that. Firstly, it's like, I'm not going to brook any opposition, but I also wondered whether there was a bit of a kind of, this is for people who might be supporting reform, who are against central government, and just he was going to have a swing at them. But he said, I'm not going to drain the swamp, but then had really what was quite rude was this thing about Whitehall is full of people who like the warm bath of the comfort of the managed decline. That was pretty rude.
Not even warm. Tepid.
Oh, tepid. Was it tepid?
Yeah, it wasn't even warm.
But I think in relation to immigration, and I heard your question, Beth, about why, when immigration is so important, it's not one of the 6 milestones. And he did talk a lot about immigration in his speech and criticised the Tories and said what was going to be done. But I did wonder whether or not he could have had a milestone. I mean, obviously, public trust was totally breached about targets when the Conservatives said they were going to cut immigration down to the tens of thousands, and it went up to nearly 1 million. So clearly picking a target about legal or illegal migration has got a lot of bad history with it. But I think what he could have done is he could have picked a target on the increase in removals, because that is something they're really focusing on. But he can always add that. Or he could have done a target on the prosecutions of the traffickers.
You're 100% right on this, honestly. And I think what's really odd, that I found odd anyway, was that I read quite a lot of the pre-stuff, and there'd obviously been briefings, because all the papers had the police numbers, which was the big headline takeaway, but there was also briefing around the speech, and almost everything in that had something about immigration, and then there was nothing in the speech itself. And I'm wondering if there was something that got taken out. And I get that they're very nervous about the number of net migrants that come to the country, whether that's both illegal or legal. But you are so right in the fact that one of the levers that they do have is being able to speed up assessments, being able to put people onto planes. I mean, they could easily have put something in there. And Harry, we don't always agree, but I could not agree with you more on this in terms of how they could approach that in a way that it works for them and it works to reassure the public.
He said, didn't he, last week when he did a migration speech, I'm not going to pick a number pluck it out of the thin air. I'm not going to have a cap and then not meet it. I'm not going to kind of play those games. But given how much we have been talking about reform, and I can tell you a bit about this Spectator dinner where Nigel Farage was at this dinner. The Spectator magazine has a Parliamentarian of the Year award dinner every year. It's very bipartisan. Everyone goes along, all stripes and different colours of parties, and awards go to all politicians of all different political affiliations. He won Newcomer of the Year, and he stood on stage and he said, well, I might be a newcomer because, this was, I know, his 7th or 8th attempt to become an MP. He said, but don't you all worry. In a few years, there will be hundreds of newcomers because I'm coming and I'm basically going to be the next Prime Minister. And I think a few politicians there were quite stunned. And it just got me thinking I understand about the arbitrary targets, but if it's a priority and you really think you're going to be judged on it, put it in the milestones, pick a target and say, I pledge to cut it.
But he can still do that. He said he's going to reduce legal and illegal migration. That's one of the things he said he would do. But I think that there would be a worry about what the impact of a great amount of reduction of legal migration might be on the other 2 milestones, which are building houses that need people from abroad often to come in and help us build them, and also the NHS. So I don't think the intellectual distinction between a foundational principle and something which is a milestone is something that kind of worked out. But I do agree with you, Ruth. There was no narrative. There was no overarching vision. But you don't have to do that every time. And sometimes when you do that, people go, we've fed up with the vision. We just want to know the nuts and bolts of what you're going to do. This was the chalk marks on the ground for ministers, civil servants, local councils. Look, we're in government. We've got a majority. Crack on and do it.
See, now I get that, and you're absolutely right that it doesn't always have to have a narrative arc, and not all speeches need to be constructed like that. But I'm struggling to think of a time that he's really done that ever, and that it's landed, because we're 5 months in or something, and I still don't know what I'm supposed to think this government is working towards in 5 years and then 10 years, how the country's going to change.
And Harriet, the location of it was Pinewood Studios. I thought I was going to be on the set of James Bond, but I was actually in a massive hangar with black curtains. It was not quite the glamour that I was expecting. Why was that an important location, do you think?
Well, I think it's really important. You see the Prime Minister every week in Prime Minister's Questions. You see him on summits abroad with loads of world leaders. It's really important to see him out and about in the country of which he's Prime Minister. So I was very excited to hear he was going to Pinewood, emphasising the creative industries, which are so important for our economy. But then, because I thought there'd be some massive film set behind, which would be really appealing to look at, but I didn't really see that. I think he should have been a bit more bold in setting it in a James Bond studio or something like that. But actually, there is a serious point about taking us with him as the viewer around our country. And one of the best people on this was actually Alex Salmond, who always would be speaking about something to do with Scotland in front of a castle, in front of some cliffs, in front of a mountain, in front of a city. And he would take us with him round his amazing country. And I know Keir does go around the country, but I'd like him to take us to some venues so we can see him and kind of feel united about the whole country. So location is important.
There is actually some quite nice bits of Pinewood Studios that are like iconic and identifiable.
And there's lots of sets.
But the whole set dressing, it looks exactly like a pre-election manifesto launch.
Labour Party conference.
Yeah, it looked like a manifesto launch. It looked like a relaunch. They kept saying it's not a relaunch.
But this is the thing. They kept saying that it's not a relaunch. But I have to say, it did feel like a flat manifesto launch. It felt like deja vu for me. I was like, I did this in May when they launched the steps. I did this when they did the manifesto in Manchester. And it felt like a kind of campaign launch, which when you're 5 months into government, it was a bit weird, if I'm honest.
What was also quite weird was having clapping in it. And I think in a way, a serious, sensible, workmanlike speech, setting out the direction of travel, setting out the determination and the priorities. It was quite odd that some people felt they needed to clap, and suddenly there would be loads of clapping when there wasn't really much of a clap line.
But at least he's out there doing that. You know, we're not seeing Kemi doing the same sort of thing. We're not seeing Nigel Farage in the 5 months since the election doing that. You know, at least he's going out and trying to make the pitch. But it does feel as if all three of the main parties are kind of like walking through treacle right now.
When I was discussing it with them ahead of the speech, because they did try and talk to us about how they wanted to frame it, I think there was a view within Number 10, certainly, that they were prepared for what someone described as a kind of wall of cynicism when they launched this, because they accept that kind of politics is broken and there's an anti-politics sentiment in the country. And I think Starmer is a bit, he's a tough old middle-class man of a certain age. Sorry, I can't help it. But I mean, the point is he's quite tough, really, and he's kind of methodical. He knows what he wants to do and he's going to do it. And I guess the view is that if they do manage to, say, build the homes that they're promising, if they do manage to clean up energy and get all that green energy around the country, if he can hit these targets, he might be having a really different conversation with the electorate when he goes in to an election. And I guess that's the point. If he lands this stuff and if he can galvanise Whitehall, can he see off the threat of reform? Is this speech going to answer his troubles, Harriet?
So basically, he's clearly worried about reform. And he said that he doesn't want populism of easy answers, which solve no one's problems. And the way to address that is to deal with the reality of the dissatisfactions in people's lives. And that is what these missions are going to do.
And Ruth, how much of a miss do you think it was to not put migration front and square in the retail offer to voters?
I think it's been a calculation that's been made in that, look, Starmer's not got an exciting X factor. He's not going to inspire the imagination. He's never going to be loved. So they obviously decided that they're going to make a calculation and they want him to be trusted. So this is about like kind of laying down markers for future demonstration that he did what he said he would do. My worry is that in the gap that exists where there is no kind of pizzazz or inspiration or narrative or whatever, that creates a vacuum, and it makes it very easy for a populist to come in and to do the hearts and the imagination-y bit. If he can't do it, he needs to let some other people in his cabinet that can do it fill that space and tell that story and give the imagination, give life to this government. Because at the moment, it is very dry, it is very kind of managerial, and it doesn't feed the soul.
I guess the thing that he would say, or his team would say, is that he came into politics, he knew what he wanted, he won the leadership. Everyone said you'll never win the election. He won the election. Like, maybe he'll do it, and maybe his sort of methodical approach will work. Okay, well, look, let's have a quick break, and then we'll be back to talk about Gregg with 2 Gs. Well, we are back, and we do want to talk about middle-class women of a certain age. Imagine some of you are listening to this podcast. Some of us are on this podcast, because this is all about comments that MasterChef's Gregg Wallace made after allegations came in about his conduct. He did go on to apologise for pointing the finger at middle-class women of a certain age. Harriet, are you one of those women?
Absolutely, a badge of pride. But there's so much to this. For a start, I don't think women want to be divided into older women and younger women, or middle-class women or working-class women. And I think that middle-class women of a certain age are the absolute nightmare for every misogynist man, because we have really done stuff and we believe in stuff and we are not shutting up, and we are going to speak up for our younger sisters who are enduring what we had to endure when we were younger, and we're actually not wanting anybody to have to put up with it anymore. So I think he probably thought in the era of Trump and Farage, he could just take a slap at these middle-class women of a certain age. And he got a real surprise, because the thin purple, green and white line of feminism held. That actually we now know something about this country that we didn't know before, which is we are not America. And that Trump-style sort of behaviour, it doesn't work here. All that bold chat in the pub, it doesn't speak for Britain anymore. And so now we've got a new law came into effect in October, that employers have actually got to protect their staff from sexual harassment. But, I used to love MasterChef, and it's completely spoiled my enjoyment of him. So I think this has been a very big moment about what is okay and what is not okay in this country now. And what is certainly okay is middle-class women of a certain age.
Sorry,
Yeah.
do you know, I'm laughing. I'm laughing so hard. You and I are sniggering all through this. And I think we're sniggering for the same reason, which is that I cannot tell you how much I've been looking forward to this. I mean, you were going to talk about Gregg Wallace, and even if it's a bit old and hairy and it's been around for a bit, we have the high priestess of feminism on. And I just, there's so many things I want to say about Gregg Wallace, but I don't want to take time away from Harriet. Just wind her up and let her go, because this is brilliant. And she's not disappointing. Harriet, get in and tell him.
We can't top you on this, Harriet.
But, there's lots and lots of political pods, but we are the political pod that can actually discuss this. This is public policy. This is a change in the law. And a lot of those male pods, they don't know what's going on and they can't talk about it confidently. We do.
The whole reason this blew up was because he thought this was a genius answer. So he's been taken off the air while they investigate stuff. And he just sat in his office and videoed himself just having a chat about how this was an absolute outrage and how he was really the victim here, because he's had 4,000 contestants and only 13 women who were all middle class and of a certain age spoke up. It's okay, well, 13 is quite a big number to start with, and that's only just the start. And also, mate, why do you think that some wee 20-year-old sous chef who's wanting to get on in the restaurant industry isn't complaining about you? Why do you think that some housewife that's come through the normal MasterChef, who's never been on telly in her life, doesn't know how it works, isn't complaining to the BBC about you? Why do you think that it is women who are older, who are secure in their employment, who are secure in their position in the world, that feel able to talk out and to take you on? And do you know why it is? Because you do get to a certain age, and frankly, you will not take any shit anymore. You are done with men perving over you, saying you've got a cracking set of tits, love, whatever it is, you are done, and you will not take it anymore.
I saw it, and I just was like, that is a catastrophic error to say that. In a way, everyone rallied behind the middle-class women of a certain age, and it actually felt like you were, for once, given a warm blanket rather than a wet fish around your face.
I don't think he would have done it had he not been emboldened by the sort of misogyny from Trump, which seems to be on the ascendancy, and also by Andrew Tate. I reckon he thought he didn't need to apologise if I've offended anybody. And when he said that, I had a nervous moment, because I thought, I wonder whether or not there will be an uprising of misogyny, and that he will be carrying the banner forward and there will be a terrible backlash against us. And I feel really proud of our country, and I feel proud of the women and men in it who are saying, no, this is not all right. So it's telling us something. We can't be complacent that there won't be more pushbacks and more backlash. But for now, I feel proud of what my generation has done. We've still got to support younger women for all the reasons you talked about, Beth. The problems are not solved. We're winning the argument. Now we've got to win it in practice.
And actually, what was really heartening was the number of men that went, look, mate, you're an arse. And particularly the number of working class people that said, don't say that it's working class people that make women feel uncomfortable, that make them feel degraded, that make them feel terrible, that's some sort of class trait, because it's not. Because actually, we treat our wives and our daughters and the people in our community and our women well, don't you dare say that that's an income or an education issue. But it's about whether any kind of conduct that's happened has violated someone's dignity or created an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, offensive environment for somebody. And it's, my understanding is that Labour are considering upgrading even the upgrade to go from employers have to take reasonable steps, so employers have to take all reasonable steps. So we were talking about how to bring in a new policy, how to cascade it down. So these are things that companies are having to think about, because do you know what? It's not okay to go to your work, be treated like shit, and have people perv over you.
And this is the law that came in because it was a private members' bill. Yeah. That's quite interesting. It was supported by a Lib Dem MP. But the most important thing we now know is that Britain is woke. Hooray!
Is it? Before we go, we have absolutely loved getting pictures of your Spotify rap. We mentioned it at the top of the show. It's very cool to see that you have listened to our podcast this year. We only launched it in March, and now look at us. It's like a warm bath, not a tepid bath, a warm bath to get into every day. But by the way, next week, we're going to be answering all your questions for one last time this year. So do ask us anything. Send us voice notes, your predictions for 2025, anything festive. We're here for it. And you can WhatsApp the burner phone. And it is 07934 200 444, or email us at electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. And then we're going to have a treat for the week after that. Is it that they're all going to give us a Secret Santa little present? Maybe a glass of Prosecco while recording?
We have a couple of presents to unwrap. We've got some extras coming. We've got some extra people coming.
Yeah, we could wrap them up and then they could burst out of the Christmas tree or something. Quite like that.
One of them might cut through the wrapping paper with a sword.
With an ornamental sword. That's a clue.
On that cliffhanger, we are now going to go. So we will see you next week. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye. And before we go, we should say Sky News has contacted representatives for Gregg Wallace for comment on the allegations against him. His lawyers say that it is entirely false that he engages in behaviour of a sexually harassing nature. A BBC spokesman has said that any issues raised are taken seriously and that there are robust processes in place to deal with them. And they added, "We are always clear that any behaviour which falls below the standard expected by the BBC will not be tolerated." Banijay UK, which is the MasterChef production company, has appointed a law firm to lead its investigation, and it said that the company takes complaints incredibly seriously, but it will not comment on individual allegations while the investigation is ongoing.